So on the topic of suicide, I mean, we know that, these are some staggering figures here. We know that men kill themselves at a greater rate than women do. And that's the same all over the world. It varies a little bit by decade, it varies a bit by culture, but the stats are pretty much the same everywhere. Even in China, rural China was an exception for a while, but that caught up in the last couple of decades. That's progress for you. It's one of these things. If you're interested in men's mental health, you would think that you'd be interested in the phenomenon of male suicide because it's such a large thing. However, I've found over the years that lots of psychologists, the very people who you would think would be most interested in this, it doesn't really go on their radar at all. In fact, as an undergrad about 25 years ago, when the subject of depression came up, we talked an awful lot about why it was that women suffered from major depression more than men. And of course, that's an important issue. But when it came to trying to understand why men killed themselves more than women did, the answer given by the tutor was that men are better at DIY and they're more aggressive, so they're just more effective at killing people, things, animals, and killing themselves. I don't know. And there was a bit of a laugh, but it was kind of like people were actually, I think, just thinking this is funny, not an exasperating laugh. I just kind of thought, this is a bit strange. I didn't really have any thoughts at that time about male psychology, but it just struck me as odd that I was at this supposedly pretty good institution learning supposedly the cutting edge science about things. This place had a good reputation for research. And we had talked a lot about various theories and research about depression in women, but when it came to male suicide, it just was reduced to a little joke. And I just thought, that's kind of strange. And that stayed with me for years and kind of built up over years. And so eventually, I started getting involved in trying to do something to help it myself. And the kind of questions that kind of get raised when you think about why do men not seek help as much as women do, the typical answer that we have is, men are just stoical and stubborn. They're too macho. They just refuse to sort of admit that they have problems. So it's kind of their fault. In some ways, you could say that's a kind of a victim blaming approach. But we, in the Male Psychology Network, so we're thinking things of, is what's on offer for men just maybe not as appealing as it is to women? So like the kind of usual thing in talking therapy. Is it something about the way that we pitch or advertise help for people with mental health issues? Maybe that's it. Maybe it appeals less to men than it does to women. Or it could be that men just think that therapy is not for them, and it might not work as well for them. In fact, there is some research evidence for that. One of the things that I've worked in health research in the medical field for a number of years too. And in medicine, people are very good at looking at how men do when they're given a particular medication compared to how women do. And or surgical technique or anything. It's just like gender is one of the demographics that you'll put into your analysis, and it would seem ridiculous if you didn't. You would have to be looking at a purely gynecological problem, for example, not to include a comparison of men and women. But in psychological research, we often don't. We often just sort of say, well, we gave 100 participants this procedure, and this is the results, and this is there was no effect of age, there was no effect of education, and gender doesn't figure in the whole thing at all. And that's a bit balmy, and it's actually more alarming than balmy, well, it's both. There's a very good study, Wright and McLeod, published recently. It's a good study. There was about 300 participants in total. They were given short-term counselling for work-related stress. And they found that comparing baseline to immediately post the therapy, men and women did equally well. So that's good. And actually, in most research, never gets as far as comparing men and women pre and post their therapy. But this research went a bit further, and they did a 6-month follow-up. And they found that the women continued to improve 6 months following the end of therapy, which is brilliant. But the men had fallen right back to baseline levels, which is terrifying. And in a way, it makes you think we should be really alarmed. I mean, the psychology community should be alarmed. We should be thinking, what the hell are we doing wrong? Well, can't we do a bit better than this? We're failing, well, not 50% of our customers, but we're failing maybe 35% of our customers. So that's the kind of state we're in just at this point. We've done some research looking at whether therapists think that men and women need different procedures or different types of therapy, or they seek help differently from each other. And what we did is we started off asking life coaches. We thought that maybe life coaches would be a good place to start, because one of our hunches at the beginning, and this is going back about 10 years now, was that maybe men didn't seek help as much as women do, because usually therapy involves talking about your feelings a lot, and women like to do that. By the way, apologies for making massive generalizations here, but these are generalizations, and I don't think that all men are the same or all women are the same, but just broadly speaking, if you look at kind of group differences, you'll see that there are definitely need differences between groups. So women in general tend to prefer, if they've got problems, to talk about them. Men kind of don't like it. That was our hunch. So we thought, well, maybe if we talk to life coaches, we might see some people with some more insight into male clients and the way the male mind thinks, because it's a more kind of solution-focused type of thing. With coaching, you don't really have to talk about your childhood or your feelings or things like that. And what we found was that 90% of them reported some sort of sex difference in either the preference of the clients or the kind of things they wanted to talk about or the way they sought help. But interestingly, we found that about 2/3 of them showed in these interviews, these are kind of interviews analysed using grounded theory, in these interviews they seem to be kind of reluctant to talk about having been able to see that men, some of their male clients, had this sort of preference for therapy, and some of their females had this other kind of preference for therapy. And they do things like say, I hate to generalize, but men tend to come and talk about their work-related problems, and women tend to come along and talk about their relationship issues. But they do this kind of roundabout thing, or else they'd sometimes say, no, I don't see any differences at all. Men and women are all the same. But then a couple of minutes later in the interview, they're saying how women tend to do this and men tend to do that. So there's definitely some sort of strange ambivalence going on. We did a small study of hypnotherapists. We found a similar thing in terms of sex differences. And we also then we looked at psychologists, counselors, and psychotherapists. And we found again, everyone saw there was some sort of sex differences in their clients and their needs in some sort of significant way. And also, we also saw this ambivalence about talking about gender. And we started then becoming more interested in this ambivalence about talking about gender differences. Because it was kind of like when you do research, you never quite know what you're going to find. And this was one of these interesting, unexpected findings. But overall, what we found was that women wanted to discuss, when we've got problems, in general, by and large, according to these experienced therapists, women want to talk about their feelings, whereas men just want to fix the problem. They don't really want to start talking about how they feel about it. They want to fix the problem. And it's one of those things, sometimes when you do research too, you find something new and interesting, but occasionally you just kind of find something and just think, hang on a second, I could have walked down the road to the bus stop and asked anybody, who's standing there, how do men and women kind of deal with their problems, like their feelings, like what do they do? And they would have said something like, women want to talk about their feelings and men just want to fix the problem. And, I think sometimes with academics or therapists or people who seem to be experts in these sorts of things, you end up kind of missing some really obvious truths, like things that to the person standing at the bus stop who hasn't got a counselling degree or psychology degree will just sort of see through straight away. A colleague of mine, in fact, he's the guy who started up all the male psychology stuff that we're doing now. It's a clinical psychologist, Martin Seeger, coined the phrase male gender blindness to describe this thing of kind of being more attentive to the problems and needs that women are having and kind of not really seeing them so easily when they're problems affecting men. And so we saw this, I think, a bit with these generalizations. We saw kind of a fuzziness about identifying gender differences and kind of an assumption that the kind of therapy that people are trained to do was quite sufficient for men and women. So they kind of were a little bit blind to the fact that actually men were wanting other things, but were not really the things that we're trained so much to deal with. And so we wonder why this might be. And there's a phenomenon in research called beta bias, which is the tendency to overlook any gender differences and treat men and women as if they're the same. And in a way, that sounds fair enough. I mean, it sounds like, equality, just treat men and women as if they're the same. And I think that works as a concept, but maybe there's exceptions, and this has got to be an exception, like when you've got people who maybe don't get as much out of something as important as therapy because you're overlooking a gender difference. And so we looked into this a bit. By the way, beta bias was a bit of a kind of a reaction to what was seen as called alpha bias, which was the tendency in research to look mainly at gender differences and kind of emphasize gender differences more than maybe was necessary. So I think maybe have a sort of more of a culture now where we say, well, there's more similarities than differences between men and women, which is definitely true. There's more similarities than differences between men and women, without a doubt. But sometimes it's the differences that are important, and like there might be just a few little differences, but maybe they're the really crucial things. I mean, Martin Seeger pointed out to me, mice and humans genetically are about 95% similar. So there's more similarities than differences, but hopefully we treat our male clients and all our clients kind of better than we treat mice. I mean, it's a strange thing to ignore differences to that degree. And I think so. We have this situation where this kind of nice idea of seeing men and women as being the same, as a kind of an equality type of thing, has sort of gone maybe a little bit too far and kind of obscured our vision of some things, leading to male gender blindness and what's called by some people the gender empathy gap. So this is when we tend to have more sympathy for women. So if a man and woman have the same sort of problem, we tend to have more sympathy for the woman than we will for the man. And there is some evidence for this. And in fact, for those of you who know about social psychology, there's something called social identity theory. And when I learned about this as an undergraduate, I was told that no matter what groups you're talking about, whether it's kind of racial identity or kind of football teams or anything, I mean, it could be just an arbitrary label like everyone here is group X and all of you people are group Y. And what we'll find is that people tend to kind of form in-groups and out-groups. So all the group X people will be saying, we're actually a tiny little bit better than the group Y people, they're not quite as good. And if you've got an opportunity to, say, share biscuits or something afterwards, you'll share them more with your own in-group than with the out-group. And it sounds like you might be doubting it. There's loads of studies that have found that to be true. And it was presumed to be true of any group that you could that existed naturally or could be manufactured. But in fact, it turned out that uniquely, the only group identity that doesn't elicit this sort of in-group favoritism is the male identity. So women will kind of favor other women and disfavor men, but men will favor other women, but they won't favor other men. And that seems very counterintuitive because you think about things like, like the old boys network and things like that, or if you think about the way, like, groups like platoons in the army or something like that, they will all sort of stick together. They'll really bond together. But if you think a little bit further, those sorts of groups have a different identity. Like, they're not bonding together because they're men, or the old boys network isn't because they're boys, it's because they're all from the same university or college or whatever it is, or they're from the same platoon, or they support the same football team. So it's not really about male identity. So you have this really interesting thing of kind of men not really supporting themselves, and actually women not really supporting men so much either. I think a lot of this stuff is counterintuitive. I mean, because I suppose in a way we get told the opposite quite a bit of the time in the media and also in academia quite a bit. So possible explanations. This idea of male disposability. So men in evolutionary terms being the protectors of society and who might be needed to, if, say, like you have a neighbouring tribe that tries to kind of invade your village, like it's the men who are kind of physically stronger and will have to, again, large ladies, don't try and hit me. We're talking again group differences, kind of. So men, like by and large, kind of on average, will be kind of more strong than the average woman, and we see that in sports and things like that. So, so men are more expendable, and because they have to be. If a certain type of person is going to be alive one day and dead the next day because they have to defend the village, you don't want to get too emotionally attached to them, really. And everyone's got to do that. It'll be just too distressing. So there's this concept of male disposability. And there's also the thing of like, in terms of population growth, if like women are more important than men for that. And it's just like, if you do a thought experiment, like, if you have 100 women and 1 man, what's the population growth compared to if you got 100 men and 1 woman? It's obviously, in those crucial survival terms, women are basically more important than men. But bad news for the guys in the audience. Don't feel too bad. I don't know if it gets much more hopeful, but it's just evolution. Don't take it personally. And there's other things like what's being described as the women are wonderful effect. So this is the idea that we just tend to see women as being sort of nice, caring people, whereas we have a kind of a stereotype of men as being violent. Okay, and that's an interesting thing. I'm kind of quoting eagerly here, like the idea of a stereotype of men as being violent, because we can probably all think about kind of violent men. It's harder to think about violent women. And the same sort of with women are wonderful. We probably all have moms who are very nice and caring, things like that to us, and maybe dads who are a bit more distant, we didn't see them as much, we got less cuddles from our dads and things like that. That may well be true. I guess maybe this is where stereotypes come from. But again, Martin Seeger, who's done an awful lot of male psychology, came up with this concept that seemed to encapsulate a lot of these different ideas, and which he called gamma bias. And this is the idea that we tend to, and this again, if you've done a psychology degree, you might have come across the idea about all the different cognitive biases and errors that are normal for everybody to have. So, for example, it's normal for people to be unrealistically optimistic about their chances of bad things not happening to them compared to somebody who's similar to them. And I'm not going to mention a very topical example of that, but it hasn't stopped people coming here tonight. It's normal for everyone to have these sort of cognitive distortions. And so myself and Martin developed this sort of theory of how we've got these cognitive distortions around gender. And they tend to be a combination of 2 different biases I mentioned already. A combination of alpha bias, where sometimes you exaggerate the gender difference, or you highlight gender, and beta bias, where you minimize gender differences, or you obscure gender. We found that sometimes when we think about gender issues, we do something that sort of behaves in both ways simultaneously. And so here's some examples. And you might not agree with all of these, and there's exceptions for definite. And of course, these are distortions. It's not a completely black and white thing. It's been like kind of magnifying one thing and minimizing another, or just kind of creating enough of a difference between them that it's just to some degree noticeable. So like we have UN days, like we had the International Women's Day is a big UN day. And we've got, in fact, 4 different international days for women. We don't have, from the UN. The UN doesn't have an international day for men. International Men's Day is on the 19th of September, November. I should be able to remember that day. So, but that, in fact, is the UN's International Toilet Day. So I'm not sure whether they're having a bit of a joke there at men's expense. But we, like International Women's Day, it's like saying, hooray for women, aren't women brilliant? You know, and it's not really saying women are, like, certain achievements are brilliant and women do these things. It's kind of more like putting the women first. So for situations where people are doing good things, we tend to emphasize that they're women, or emphasize the gender when it's women doing them. Whereas when men are doing things that, and I've just picked an example here of like kind of dirty, dangerous jobs, we tend not to kind of see them so much as hooray for the men. Like, so, like your bin man kind of out in the morning collecting your rubbish, doing like, it's, a bit of a thankless task and not very glorious. But like we tend to ignore that whole thing. We don't think about men or women really at all for that sort of thing. And there's other examples. So when harm is perpetrated by a person, we tend to, if it's by a man, we tend to kind of amp up the male part of it. So we get ideas like toxic masculinity, which has become, almost like its own little toxic sort of entity in itself, I think, in some ways. But this idea that you can have certain types of behaviour that can be described as toxic masculinity, I think is a bit off key. For example, if we labelled behaviour that was typical of other demographics as being toxic, like we have toxic Islam or toxic blackness or things like that, or toxic femininity, we would just say, actually no, we don't like it, we make our hair stand up on end. But with toxic masculinity, it seems to be much more acceptable. Whereas on the other hand, if women commit similar crimes to lots of times that men do, there's lots of research finding that women will get lesser sentences, and in fact there have been calls quite a lot, and it may well happen that almost all women's prisons will be closed and reopened as men's prisons. I mean, this is one idea that gets kind of up to Parliament kind of quite regularly. And also it's when good things happen to men or women, it tends to be like more suspicious if it happens to a man. So like if a man has got a higher wage, we think about things like the sexist wage gap and patriarchy, like privilege, old boys club and things. But for privileges that women get, or things going good for women, we tend to not really think about them in that sort of negative way. So, like lots of people aren't aware that for decades we've had boys falling behind girls in school. And so, for example, at University, this is from about 2 years ago, but for every 13 girls going to university, there's only 10 boys. And we don't really know what happens to boys. We don't think it's interesting that there's not really much research done on this. We don't think that they go off and have brilliant entrepreneurial careers or anything like that, or do other brilliant things with their lives. We think they're probably playing video games and smoking dope and stuff like that. And I think another good example of this sort of gamma bias is domestic violence. Until very recently, when we've had some high-profile stuff in the news by Mankind Initiative have been highlighting male victims of domestic violence. We have for years just thought about domestic violence as being something that happens to women and it's from men. But in fact, if you look at there's huge amount of research that shows that actually rates of domestic violence are not 50-50, but they're more like about, say, 35% versus 65%, or 55%. Bit of balance, aren't they? But we have loads of research on this, but it's kind of really difficult for it to penetrate the public mind or even the powers that be, because we tend to sort of just distort these things. We kind of tend to dismiss or kind of ignore information that doesn't support some of these preconceived ideas that we have. So I think gamma bias is quite a good way of framing a lot of the issues that we see that are facing men today. And I think it's a bit of a challenge to try and think of these things, but it's worth doing it. I mentioned about male violence being a stereotype earlier. So what is a stereotype? Well, 95% of the people convicted of homicide are men, and 75% of the victims are also men. There's other things, like being male is kind of one of the biggest predictors of violence, kind of violent crime. So there's men being violent. I mean, how much of a stereotype is that? There's other predictors of crime too, like being young and also being from a disadvantaged background. They're very big predictors for men and women. And so the thing is, it's quite easy to think, well, men are violent, men are criminals. But it's actually just a minority of men who commit most of the crime. I mean, a lot of people have heard of that sort of idea, but it's hard to sort of make it sort of challenge the stereotype that we often have of men being more violent than women. And of men being violent just in and of themselves. In some ways, then, if you think about things like men being violent, or kind of most of the rape convictions being men too, you might think, well, maybe men aren't that nice, or maybe it's masculinity. Maybe masculinity is to blame. And it's interesting. In psychology, up to a few decades ago, men or masculinity used to be described as adjectives like being active, dominant, self-contained, being stoical, being competitive. But this changed around the 1990s. We had this movement started in the States that talked about the new psychology of men, which actually talked about masculinity as a kind of a problem, basically. And so, like, masculine characteristics being things that cause mental health issues for men, and also was behind a lot of domestic violence. And we also found that so instead of just like being competitive or stoical or aggressive, masculinity was now being described as including things like being sexist and being homophobic. And these were kind of new definitions of masculinity. And so, we now have the situation where things like, in terms like toxic masculinity, are just absolutely commonplace. Everybody uses it. No one thinks about it very much. And I suppose in lots of ways you can just say, well, toxic masculinity, we're talking about just a small group of men. It's not all men, it's just a small group of men. But I think it's one of these things that if you tag on a word like toxic onto a term for a demographic, it seems to taint the whole of the demographic. I don't think there's any way of it not doing that. So just in terms of the psychological impact, I think it's probably not a brilliant term to use. I would argue, I can see where it comes from, but I'd argue that it might be insulting at the least, and potentially, I would say, also maybe damaging to the self-esteem of boys who are exposed to this sort of narrative, and also to men too. And some people might not agree with that, but in fact, I've just done some research that proves that I'm right about this. So I can just be all smug. So there is a different competing view that's kind of sprung up again in the States in the 90s, which looked at masculinity as being potentially positive. So it kind of stems from the positive psychology movement, but it kind of looked at masculinity in terms of being potentially useful, like a set of guidelines that might be useful for men. And if you take it too far, it's going to backfire. If you're stoical, it means that you can kind of rein in your feelings, so you can deal with difficult situations without freaking out and losing control. But if you take that too far and never talk about your feelings or never ask for help, well, then that's going to be damaging. So the positive psychology, the positive masculinity view of masculinity is that it's potentially useful. Questions after? Thanks.
Not a question, just wanted to chuck something in here.
Chuck something at me afterwards.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. So there has been some research evidence that has found that some of these ideas work. So, for example, again, Martin Seeger has done some work with the Samaritans and found that if you train call line workers, again, Samaritans are wondering why men are not phoning them as much, or when they phone up, why they ring off much quicker than women do. And so Martin Seeger trained some of the call line workers to listen to men differently. Basically, think about men as having a different way of communicating than women, so that they wouldn't talk about their feelings immediately, whereas a lot of female callers might. but they might even start off by talking about something that seems to be irrelevant. They'll take that sort of communication as being irrelevant, and would kind of not think that the person phoning in was not taking things seriously. So that sort of call would tend to kind of not last very long. But after they went on Martin Seeger's Man Talk workshop, they were able to kind of like suspend their kind of their usual attitude towards doing this sort of telephone work, and sort of let a little bit of banter go on, or let a little bit of a relevant discussion go on before maybe kind of moving more into the area that was really being phoned up about. And to me, that just makes a lot of sense. I mean, you just sort of, not being too judgmental about the way that somebody is talking, you just sort of give them a bit of space, and that's all that we're doing. I did a couple of reports in the UK and in the States with Harry's kind of barber products, and I found that in terms of masculinity, I think there was a lot to be positive about. I mean, the aspiration that men had were to be sort of honest and reliable and dependable. They weren't kind of aspiring. This was loads of people. We had a couple of different recruiting methods. I mean, it's kind of quite kind of solid findings. But it's difficult to look at the findings of these surveys and think these are men who are sort of bastards or violent or nasty in any way. They seem to be men who are struggling. In fact, we found that by far the strongest predictor of their mental health in both the UK and the US was job satisfaction. So the more they felt that they were getting from their job, the better their mental health. And the second thing was relationship stability. So the better their relationship, or whether they're married or not, was also related to their mental health. So we got the impression then that men were kind of really struggling and vulnerable too, like vulnerable to having like poor mental health if their job wasn't good or if their relationship wasn't good. So I think that there's maybe a lot to be positive about men and masculinity. And certainly, a lot of the research that we've done makes us think that we need to rethink therapy. Like we kind of have a one-size-fits-all approach at this point. And one way of helping to generate new ideas about how to help men's mental health is to look at the kind of things that men do to relax and unwind, and in fact the kind of things that have been shown to improve men's mental health. So here's one that would be popular. Going to the pub and having a couple of social drinks with friends is good for your mental health. This study was done in Glasgow, as a matter of fact, and this is this is not the same. And I think we have some statistics about people drinking themselves to death and things like that. This isn't the same. So this is about going to the pub. Having a couple of drinks with a couple of friends, loosening it, like the drink making it kind of a little bit more relaxed. You might talk about what's going on with yourself a little bit more. That seems to be what the study was saying. Another study has found similar findings. Men's sheds is also kind of a popular thing. It's like kind of men get together. It's not a therapeutic thing. It's like an informal thing. It's like on Saturday morning for a couple of hours. Guys get together to fix garden furniture, and it's just like that process. They sort of get together, doing something, just sort of knocking about, talking about the weather and stuff. Seems to help, especially obviously if somebody's socially isolated, that will help. But it just seems like this sort of informal communication, nothing too intense, no big sharing of feelings, seems to be something that helps men a lot. And of course, one of the things Men's Sheds, I suspect, doesn't want to do is to get a reputation for being a big mental health program, because I think once men think about something as being for their mental health, they're probably, no, I'm not going to go with that. Chatting with the barber, like that seems to be something that's quite popular too. Like it's the Lions Barbers Collective has done quite a bit of work, and in fact spread internationally. And there's a new thing now where they're training their barbers to be able to like the usual sort of thing where you chat to your barber, they can kind of pick up on maybe whether you've got any kind of serious issues, and kind of signposting a little bit onto services if you do. And there's some controversy about whether barbers should be quasi counsellors or therapists, but I think in principle it's not a bad idea. It's a bit of an extension of just the usual thing of having a chat with somebody in an informal situation. And all of these things are like kind of going out and doing some daily tasks, that, like everyday tasks that you find enjoyable. I mean, this has been called behavioural activation therapy for a number of years in psychology. So it's not a kind of a really weird thing to think about stepping outside with the therapy room to help people's mental health. It does have some basis in science. And in terms of help seeking, I mean, one of the big problems, I think, in psychology, clinical psychology, health psychology, is men not coming to therapy and instead going off and killing themselves or drinking themselves stupid and getting addictions, getting into fights, ending up in prison and things like that, where they're even harder to reach in terms of any therapy. So this is an example of something I think is a bit typical of what we tend to do, which is like, you know, men don't want to talk to us. What do? We start a campaign saying, hey men, talk to us. You know, it reminds me of like some of the comedy shows where you have somebody who doesn't speak English, and like the solution to helping them to understand you is to just speak a bit louder, and that will help. It doesn't. I think we have to be a bit more creative about how we deal with the issue that we call a problem of help seeking. I mean, this could be a problem of advertising. It could be a problem with the product that we're advertising. So, like maybe offering men something different might be a better approach. And so the idea of maybe looking at kind of therapy through a positive masculinity lens might be a good thing. It's one of a range of options, but it seems to work. I mean, there's been a meta-analysis of studies of men who are seeking help for depression and coping with their depression. And I mean, pretty clear evidence that some aspects of masculinity can definitely be helpful. So, like saying that, like instead of like somebody being seen as a control freak, if they try and want to take control of things or be controlling, like if you decide you're going to take control of your mental health, I mean that's a good thing. And like if you say, okay, like be a man, take control of your mental health, that seems to be something that helps a lot of men, improve what they do. And it's a lot different than some of the other ideas that are starting to be more current, which is discouraging men from being masculine, like encouraging men to think that masculinity is a bad thing, or something that could quite easily turn toxic if they're not careful. So the kinds of things that these two chaps, Kaselka and Ingvar Carlson, have suggested is having a greater appreciation of using the strengths that lots of men seem to have, kind of male typical sort of strengths. So men often like to kind of go out together and sort of be active in groups. Maybe encourage men to do that, like if they're depressed or isolated, encourage them to do things, and not because of the psychological or emotional benefits that will put a lot of men off, but just sort of do it for its own sake. So sheds are a popular thing, like men traditionally go to sports. I mean, some of these things have become unpopular, like going to, all of these are unpopular, like going to, like hanging around your shed too much, like going after the football match or going to the pub. All these things are kind of frowned upon, really, but actually potentially there's benefits to all these things. There's downsides to these things. There's downsides to anything. I mean, I was kind of impressed was it in the 90s when you had that Om cult in Japan who gassed the underground and caused quite a lot of havoc. And this was like a Buddhist cult who did this. And I just thought, wow, these guys have managed to turn Buddhism into something horrible. It's pretty, they've gone all out with that one. And I think you can do the same with anything. You can take any code of conduct and you can turn it into, you can say, take some part of it, push it too far, it'll go wrong, it'll be damaging. Fatherhood too, I think there's a lot of social problems, I think. There's a lot of evidence that delinquency happens more often in homes that don't have a supportive dad in them. So, like, good father is a really useful thing. So, and fathering tends to be a slightly different activity than mothering, again, in general. But dads tend to do a bit more kind of mansplaining, if you like. It's a negative way of putting it, but kind of like steering their kids in particular ways, which in some ways is like men are encouraged to be a bit more kind of cuddling the kids and stuff like that, which I think is brilliant too. I would knock that in the least. But I mean, this male typical stuff has its place, and if it's what a particular guy that tends to be what he wants to do, let's not knock it too much. Like, let's maybe appreciate it. Risk-taking too, and lots of risk-taking can end up in havoc and damage and sort of criminality, but lots of it can be kind of steered in a positive direction. There's an interesting chapter in the Handbook of Male Psychology that looks at a case study of a guy with ADHD, and he was, for his teachers, a nightmare. He was just fidgeting all the time. He wouldn't couldn't seem to concentrate. But he turned out like he just had a total knack at horse racing. Like, so he became actually quite a sort of a successful jockey. And this sort of kind of dangerous activity, it's not the kind of thing that you learn in school. Like, he was just kind of lucky enough that he was kind of guided into this sort of activity. But I think there's a lot of problems like this, or what's seen as problems with boys sort of not really taking to school very much, being disruptive, not paying attention, and maybe they just need to be sort of kind of these energies channeled in a productive sort of way. And I think that might be something that we're missing, and maybe contributing to the problems of boys falling behind girls in school, which they undoubtedly now are. Men also tend to kind of be pretty good in groups. And a study that we did actually found that men like group therapy more than women do. And, women prefer kind of one-to-one thing. Actually, men like a one-to-one thing too. But if offered the option of group therapy, and that's how much they like it, men tend to like it more than women do. Some of these group dynamics can kind of work quite well for men. And I think one of the things that you sometimes hear is that men like the idea of being able to support other men. Like, so they kind of say, I'm not really going so much for me, it's like for the lads, kind of thing. But everyone's getting something out of it. And also men's use of humour. Again, with the helplines, sometimes like men sort of trying to make a joke. I mean, I suppose lots of men who have been there, like they try and make a joke and it goes down like a little balloon. And, really I think sometimes humour is about, trying to bond with people, and banter actually too, like banter which has got such a bad reputation. I think for men, like sort of having a little bit of a joke, it's kind of like how you get to know people and how you try and sort of get along with them. Like you're reaching out, trying to do something positive, but it can be taken the wrong way, in which case, like it can fall absolutely flat. But it can be a positive thing in therapy and other grounds too. And I think it might be useful if we conceive of those, especially therapists, conceive of humour in that sort of way. So just a few kind of tips and hints from some of the research that we've done. So like some of the things that we found that lots of therapists say that if you talk about what you're doing as therapy, men will tend to run a mile. Women are fine with it, men will be put off. If you change the name of your clinic from the extra therapy clinic to the problem-solving clinic, you'll have much better results. And these in some ways just seem like silly little kind of techniques or tricks, but it's things that gets a lot. Banter, same sort of thing. Just just don't decide that the guy's an idiot. Just kind of go with it for a little bit, see where it goes. And also not making emotional sharing the goal of what you're doing, but allowing for, say, starting off with some problem-solving type approaches like, even CBT, some aspects of CBT is very good for the problem-solving stuff. So sort of if that's what the person, again, it might be a woman too who prefers this sort of approach, but make sure that you allow them to do that before going into anything that might be a bit more emotionally challenging. And overall, though, empathy is the key thing. And I think a lot of people are, even people in male psychology, for some issues that men present you with, can be a massive challenge. So, like if a man is expressing his distress through anger or violence, that's a real challenge for anybody to deal with, and it's really difficult. I mean, like if you've been a victim of violence, very difficult to try and empathise with that person. And in fact, if you're a victim of violence, you don't really have to. But for therapists, I think we need to rise to that challenge a bit more of trying to, for example, familiarise yourselves with literature on the causes of violence, because you'll find that in a lot of cases, well, I found out a couple of years ago, some of some people who are actually called toxic kind of men, so the worst sex offenders, actually have got the roots of their offending in childhood sexual abuse themselves, and sometimes, in fact, in quite a lot of cases, by their own mothers. So this is horrific stuff that they will have grown up with, and and of course, like, trying to have some sort of empathy for people who do these sorts of crimes is a massive, massive challenge. But you think about, well, what are the alternatives? We can lock people up and throw away the key. Can we help them? In fact, we received wisdom is that people who are what we call psychopaths and sex offenders, there are two categories of people who are impossible to treat. And there is evidence of some success. There is evidence of some success for treating people who have those sorts of labels. So we should always, I think, have the ability to step back. It's what we're supposed to do as therapists: step back, try and see the world from the other person's point of view. And that, I think, for people today thinking about men, it's so much bad press about men. It's a massive challenge, and everyone's affected. We're affected by this. We're all living in the same sort of culture. We're all, if you've done a degree in any of the social sciences, you will have been taught in a kind of a beta-biased way about gender. So it's something that's kind of changed the way that we see the world. And I think it's useful sometimes to be able to sort of, step back beyond that, see if there's a better way of looking at things in order to find solutions to things that otherwise seem like totally intractable problems, like male violence and things. So, just to wrap up with a couple of comments. Just what I said, we need to revise our views a little bit, and empathy is the key. Just before we totally wrap up, I'm just going to plug our Male Psychology Conference at UCL on the 19th of September. Tickets still available. And you can join the Male Psychology section of the British Psychological Society if you're a psychologist, or if you're a psychologist, or if you're doing a psychology degree at any level. If you're not a psychologist but are interested in male psychology, you can join the Male Psychology Network, and you can buy our book. Loads of people have. This is, we didn't know what to expect when this book was published last year, but it's nearly a year ago. But it's turned out to be Palgrave Macmillan's one of their most successful psychology books. They got a whole stack of them. We're in the top 20% of chapter downloads. So there's, you may well be sitting there. I mean, I'm not thinking that I will be changing those people's minds overnight or anything like that. But you might be like me. You might kind of have this sort of thought, like I had about the male suicide being all about DIY skills. So if you're sitting there and you have one of those sort of moments, I'll be very happy. And also, there's our new book coming out. So that's coming out sometime later this year. And this will take, whereas this one talks a lot about mental health, and there's a chapter about gamma bias in here. About half this book is about mental health. This book is takes a more general take on lots of different aspects of male psychology. So that's it from me then. Thanks for listening.